Hello.
Our story begins in the middle of Obi-Wan and Qui Gon's stay in the Mandalore system. Padawan Kenobi was out accompanying the Duchess on Concordia and Kalevala to avoid the ruthless marauders who declared war on the peace-loving Clan Grease. By this point, Mandalore's Duke had been killed. Satine was without her mother, father, or sister, and Qui-Gon was overseeing the defense of the last standing city in Mandalore, Sundari. With Keldabe being destroyed in the Civil War, and the planet suffering from the conflict, Master Jinn was forced to meditate on these troubling times. Mandalorians had always had a temperament for one another. He couldn't change that. Though Qui-Gon couldn't help but factor in some of the nonsensical, at times, outbursts his master had regarding the political status of the galaxy, and where the Jedi Order sat within all of it. Unlike his friend, Sifo Dyas, Qui-Gon was not gifted with the incredible foresight to see into the great future. These were events that took place sometimes 10 years into the future, or even further. In the current year of 40 BBY, where Qui-Gon was 40 years old and his student 17, there were no visions of a galaxy-defining war. The Sith were extinct, but watching Mandalore engulf itself in civil war concerned him greatly. He obviously couldn't judge this system like he could any other major world around the galaxy. They were on their own spectrum, because Mandalorians like to fight, and they also apparently like to lose because they lost most of their wars with the Jedi or the Sith. But that didn't change the fact. This was a different era. These were not the dark days of the Old Republic. This was a modern republic, one without Sith influence. And even though Mandalorian civil wars were bound to happen, Qui-Gon found himself wondering if the Republic would ever find itself engulfed in a civil war. He certainly liked to hope and think that they were better than that, but he and his master knew they weren't. The continued sweeping corruption that spilled from the Senate chambers would continue to leave systems without proper guidance into the future. Planets were being ignored, neglected, and left behind because the Republic didn't want to front the bill to form a military or send humanitarian aid. It's why the Jedi were here, 2 of them. They weren't even technically allowed to intervene because it could be seen as an act from the Republic. These lingering thoughts tortured the Jedi Master, until a voice broke him from his silence. He'd been standing in on a military debriefing. Typically, Jinn lost his patience, and reverted to silent meditation instead of vocal outbursts. That was something he learned from his master. Instead of violence when he was tested, he found resolve and serenity. Qui-Gon truthfully hated being here. He knew that Obi-Wan was off on a more important mission, but Master Jinn was overseeing the war as an advisor. Without proper military training, he didn't really even know who or what he was advising. But sure, what the hell, that's what he was doing. Master Jinn looked at the map and pointed to a couple of battle points, referencing things already spoken about by the fallen Duke's council. Qui-Gon felt terrible for the daughter. She was all alone, and her only friend, after this ordeal, would be taken away. She would be left to govern her planet by herself at the age of 17, and bring them out of civil war. She wouldn't ever join the Republic, and who could blame her? She would have to send millions of credits as tax for privilege of being a part of the system, and Qui-Gon stopped himself there. He coughed heavily and told the Mandalorian advisors that from his position, the war was won. He had nothing more to say. They called him a coward for not interjecting more in their business, and Qui-Gon turned to him, already having lost his patience and his care for such angst. He reminded the Mandalorians why he was sent here, because they couldn't have the honor nor the decency to get along. If he left, they'd be damning a child to civil unrest founded before she was even born. If anyone was a coward, it was them, for having the inability to forget such regal pasts and remind themselves that they were not their ancestors. The wars were over. They were fighting for nothing but a weapon that was forged by a Jedi. Pathetic, isn't it? Groveling over a tool that they couldn't have constructed without Jedi oversight? And here he was, assisting them with finding reconciliation before they finally drove themselves and their planet to extinction. Qui-Gon frustratedly bowed, respectfully, before excusing himself. Master Jinn felt a lot of resentment towards this council, because he had seen the writing on the wall. When the Duchess returned, they would make moves to swindle her into making political choices to best aid their respective elite families. They were at one point the rich. They would profit the most off of Reconstruction, more than anyone else, if Satine allowed them. Qui Gon knew that the young Duchess had enough wit to smell that from wherever she was in this system, but he worried for her. As he exited the beat-up bunker, he looked at the wreckage of the planet. Warriors were guarding the bunker, and they didn't even acknowledge him. The Jedi Master didn't care. He, though, decided to go on a history lesson. He had heard wonderful things about the waters beneath the planet. The living waters, as they were called, were an age-old tradition on the system. He might as well familiarize himself with their history before he left. When he eventually reached it, some damage had been done, but not enough to ruin the structure. Qui Gon knelt by it and felt shame for his outburst. It wasn't right of him to do that. Maybe it was right, but it wasn't his place. And those were the words that were more comfortable than saying it wasn't right, because he at least had some sort of moral rationale in his argument. He was helping the Duchess, not the War Council who wanted to make a bid for power after they won. Qui Gon felt the grass beneath his hands and closed his eyes. He was engulfed by the warmth of the planet. Even though they were hidden under building materials and maybe hundreds of meters down, the living waters were as warm as they were calm. He didn't dare repeat Mandalorian tradition by stepping into them, but he got close enough and leveled his hand over the water and allowed it to flow under his slight manipulation of the Force. He donned a smile until something caught his eye. He initially believed it to be a reflection from above, but it was something else. Qui Gon closed his eyes again and felt through the Force. Whatever the Mandalorians believed about their mythosaur, he could feel her heartbeat. The creature was mighty, something that could feast off of him as a snack. But this wasn't a vicious creature. The people of her culture had adopted hostility over who could claim the mythosaur's identity. Some believed seeing the creature meant that they were destined for greatness. Others used it for manipulation. Qui Gon just felt connected, and despite his eyes being closed, the creature rose from the living water and looked at him. Her tusks perhaps 3 times larger than the Jedi Master himself. He was in total harmony with the animal, and he opened his eyes to greet her. A smile formed, and he raised his hand but looked away. The creature moved ever so slightly closer to him, and they touched for a moment. A revelation with this contact covered his body. Qui Gon could see the future as clearly as he could see her, if he dared to meet her eyes. This was a terrifying future, one far beyond Mandalore's war. A civil war greater in proportions, in troop numbers, and in enemies created. Qui Gon let go of the mighty mythosaur, and she slowly descended into the lake of the living waters. He felt bad, as if he had encouraged this vision by being so negative, but that was in fact a lie. He heard a grizzled voice yell across the mythical place, a singular word, Jedi. Qui Gon knew he had made a mistake the moment he heard it. Pre Vizsla, the 20-or-so-year-old leader of the Resistance, following his father's sacrificial death in the Battle of Kadabe, was here. Pre very quickly challenged the Jedi for disrespecting their kind by being here. What eluded Qui Gon the most was these barbaric fools hadn't even seen the mythosaur, which was just in front of him. There was a certain savvy in that, honestly. They were so preoccupied by their lust for violence that they hadn't even seen the one thing so much of their traditional mysticism was based off of. Master Jin shook his head and told the foolish barbarians that they needed to settle their differences, and Pre didn't care, igniting the darksaber and pointing it at Qui Gon. The Jedi Master reiterated that he didn't want to fight, and Vizsla gave him no choice. The young Mandalorian warrior, champion of multiple battles against the Defenders, charged Master Jin. He rolled out of the way before dropping his robes with a swoop of his arms and ripping an emerald lightsaber from his belt and igniting it. Qui Gon held the blade by its chest, and their blades then collided. He backed away slightly, bashing the weapon defensively, before switching into his dominant form. Qui Gon pushed back, and Pre used some of his Mandalorian tricks to stop the Jedi advance. The first included a grapple that shot around the Jedi's arms, and Qui Gon dabbed his weapon against the thick string, breaking it before being shoved backwards by an aggressive, unrelenting assault. He told Vizsla that even if he won, he would never claim Mandalore for himself. The warrior aggressively struck down and tried to disarm the Jedi Master, but he failed. Qui Gon continued defending himself by keeping his distance, and Pre pulled his pistol and fired it. The Jedi Master was grazed before precisely blocking shots and knocking the pistol from his opponent's hand. Pre charged, forgetting about his second pistol and slashing at Qui Gon. He stepped out of the way again and used the Force to tug Pre backwards, which rocked him heavily onto the ground. But Pre jumped back up, even more aggravated. The two of them exchanged more blows immediately. and Qui-Gon continued to position his lightsaber where it best kept him away from killing his foe. He didn't want to end this with death, but Pri was giving him no other choice. As their sabers raged on, slashing and clashing, with Qui-Gon growing more and more tired of the fighting, Pri attempted to end this all. He thrashed forward with a dagger from his belt, and Master Jinn stepped away, cutting through the weapon and slapping his saber up, knocking Vizsla's helmet off his head, to everyone's surprise. Jinn told him to stop, but he wouldn't. He stormed forward and Qui-Gon defended as necessary. He blocked and deflected, before shoving the darksaber into the dirt, and with one swift motion, he elbowed Pri in the chest before cutting his head off. Qui-Gon, in this move, grabbed the darksaber and raised it in his hand. The Mandalorians were appalled, and they raised their weapons at Qui-Gon, calling him a heretic. Of course, Mandalorians couldn't hold their honor. What a bundle of hypocrites! It genuinely annoyed Qui-Gon, but he raised the weapons to defend himself. As he stood over Pri Vizsla's body, the warrior clan was split. Qui-Gon told them that their honor awarded him the saber. He won it in singular combat. It was a fair victory and they knew it. Some members looked to each other before what was likely a lieutenant spoke up, telling them to surrender themselves. They had a new leader, even if they didn't agree. Some of the men turned on this individual, and the Mandalorians started their own conflict, this time with each other. Master Jinn just sighed and kept himself safe until the warriors vanished, chasing each other out of their sacred caves, and leaving the lone Qui-Gon as their victor. His immediate desire was to destroy the darksaber, but that wouldn't end anything. They would call it a sacrilegious thing, and start another unending conflict over that. Qui-Gon would bring this weapon to the Mandalorian guard in Zendari so they could see it. Their reaction would of course be underwhelming. He, though, after this back-to-back experience, came to a conclusion. The Mythosaur had showed him something damning. He was always careful when sensing the future, but this specific information was worrying enough. Qui-Gon could not return to Coruscant, because it would result in something terrible. He instead did reach out to the Council. They may have respectively disagreed, more than either party would like to admit, but Qui-Gon respected their wisdom. He understood their struggles, perhaps more than even he would like to say. In his message to the Council, he revealed very little, but requested that a branch of the Jedi Order be extended to his oversight. The members were in doubt over this, but he reminded them that not very long before, they had offered him a seat within their chambers, even before he became a full-blown master. Qui-Gon never liked to use his past for persuasion, and they knew this, so it was a cheeky way of indicating how strongly Qui-Gon felt about this position. The Council would separately put it to a vote, and by his request, a detachment of 50 Jedi volunteers would be sent to Mandalore to join Master Jinn. He didn't request permission from the Mandalorians for this, he just did it. Even more ironically, because of the Jedi position in galactic politics, these extra reinforcements weren't even for the war effort, they were for something else entirely. Qui-Gon was a little timid, admittedly, when he gathered these Jedi up inside the ashes of Kaldabe. He showed them the destruction and warned of something greater coming. He didn't call it a war, nor a vision, nor foresight. He just danced around the actual word to avoid dissension. This was a voluntary mission, so it was unlikely that they would turn their backs on him, but just in case. Before doing this, Master Jinn recorded a propaganda hologram for the defenders to use against the aggressors, hoping that in seeing the darksaber held by a Jedi, Mandalore would stop its civil war. It would work, but not for a couple more weeks. Until then, inside the ashes of Kaldabe, Qui-Gon instructed these volunteers on what he wanted. There was a fine line Master Jinn needed to walk here. He knew that at least one of these individuals was a council plant, which wasn't true, but one of them had been instructed to relay Qui-Gon's details back to the council. Well, what Master Jinn instructed was beyond what anyone thought it would be. The Mandalorian Jedi Order was an extension, a separate sect of the same beliefs. Qui-Gon, though, didn't really differentiate his instructions from what a typical Jedi practiced. They started with the rubble of civilization, and moved to a safe location on Concordia, away from the Duchess to avoid drawing attention towards her and Obi-Wan. This Jedi task force wouldn't do anything super special. Qui-Gon didn't even bring them for his protection. The war slowly unwound itself, and Qui-Gon continued leading these Jedi as if they were on a messianic pilgrimage. They didn't understand, though this did not mean they were unhappy. They enjoyed following Qui-Gon's instruction. There was just no method to his madness. The Jedi Master realized that preaching and speaking about the distinctions between civility, the Republic, greed, destruction, and peacefulness would do no good. Coruscant was a hive of activity that often muddled the reality of the galaxy. Force havens, while productive, were inconclusive. They didn't give the full story. One's own meditations could sway their perspective of their visions or their sights. This was a full story. It wasn't just practicing and using the Force. This was the story of how their galaxy could be consumed by war. See the destruction of Kaldabe. What do you feel? See the beauty of Concordia? What calls to you? These were grand methods of instruction, condensed into basic lessons. Subconsciously, he was instructing these Jedi to see what fallacies erode a people. Through their lessons, he spoke of the Duke of Mandalore and what happened to him. He used specific phrasing. He highlighted emphasis on certain words. He brought to life his historical rendition of a war he watched unfold for the last 9 months. His Padawan and the Duchess were victims. See the children? They were 17. But the burdens of the 50 Jedi, the Mandalorians, the adults, fell on the shoulders of the children. An unwillingness to act was a submission of grievances a future generations would endure. This was not some prophetic speech, the kinds the Council had become numb to from Dooku. This was a genuinely posed question, for each of them to not answer aloud, but internally resolve. The war that did come to an end would see Satine returning to her people and the Jedi Protector by her side. Obi-Wan honestly didn't know where Qui Gon was. He saw the Darksaber hollow, but aside from that, he was just waiting for Master Jinn to return to Sundari so they could go home. He was happy to have a few more days with Satine alone, and she was as well, but the stresses of her job and the importance of her role came back into focus. She got to enjoy being a kid without the stresses of politics for a year, despite being on the run for her life. Now it was time for reality check. She had mourned her father, her mother, and her missing sister. She was a duchess, and she had to confront the greedy masterminds that had just won her war. Satine understood the savviness to manipulate these powerful Mandalorian families into temporary submission. She'd elongate their debts, collect interest, and pay it off without giving them the royalties of governmental positions. They were wartime leaders. Her plans for a future, more successful Mandalore were underway now. This included rebuilding a society and making it the face of intergalactic commerce in 10 to 15 years. She may have enjoyed being tight with Obi-Wan, but she was still policy crafting when they were together. This was her transforming it into a reality. So for now, while she was sending messages to neighboring systems to start redesigning alliances and potentially opening up trade relations in the next few months, Obi-Wan was searching for Master Jinn. Well, his instructor finally came back to Sundari about a week or so after the official end of the war. But Qui Gon, as the other 50 with him informed him, they were not leaving Mandalore. Obi-Wan had to hide his joy and his grief. He was a bit homesick. Satine reduced that for him by being his best friend, but he was really confused now. Qui Gon had no time to explain, as he went to the Duchess to make her an arrangement. The Jedi Order on Coruscant was aligned with the Republic, because the Jedi needed funding, and it had been provided since the dark days of the Old Republic. That was at threat now, but Qui-Gon also understood that he could manipulate favor into his hands. He would offer the Duchess neutral protection in exchange for 1% of her planetary budget, for as long as they were here. Since the Darksaber belonged to a capable warrior, she was willing to agree. She also didn't have any problem with this, and it wasn't manipulation. At this point, Mandalore didn't have a ton of funds, but Qui-Gon was also essentially becoming the antithesis to his gripes with the Jedi Council. However, where the Jedi Order had no influence or voice, with an even smaller percentage of Republic budget, Qui-Gon had a minor voice and a larger percentage. He wasn't here for political aspirations, but to feed information to the Duchess. Had they left under normal circumstances when the war ended later, he would have given her a fully filled out document, presenting her with all the details she needed to know about her advisors, and which ones to trust and which ones to not. With him here, these same individuals would be even more cautious to make bids for power against her, because they saw his strength in victory, and they worried that he might force her hand to diminish their roles into obscurity. Qui-Gon, inversely, without needing to harp on the bureaucracy of the Republic, was able to gather a formidable force. Those who attacked Mandalore, the aggressors of the Civil War, were mostly killed off. After Pre-Vizsla's death, a group continued to fight against the Defenders until they lost. Those who sided with Qui Gon, because he rightfully won the Darksaber, had their own internal conflict. At the end of it, those who followed tradition joined the new Mandalorian regime under Satine's rule, and therefore followed Qui Gon's lead because he held the Darksaber. There was no Death Watch, that was all gone. This was Qui Gon's way to mediate domestic affairs, and also stop whatever it was that he saw in that vision. Jinn refused to elaborate what he saw, in fear that it might incur some sort of inner frustration or conflict with the others. The Jedi wouldn't turn against him per se, but all the work he did to get them to feel what he saw and felt inside that vision would all be done by verbally dictating its outcome. Master Jinn understood the importance of messaging. He displayed that here by letting people make up their own idea of what they were feeling when they saw and experienced things he felt inside that vision. Essentially, Qui-Gon used parallels of the destruction of Kaldabe to match with what he experienced. Without a rival faction on Mandalore, rebuilding was able to commence. While Qui-Gon utilized the military force at his disposal, this wasn't for actual militaristic endeavors. The Jedi Master realized that to best obtain order after giving the 50 Jedi his bizarre lesson was by entering criminal territory with an occupation force. This did ironically coincide with the vision he had with the Mythosaur. The secret of that was not to be revealed yet. The Jedi and Mandalorians didn't have to like each other. Honestly, the Jedi didn't even know why they had beef because last time they checked, they won. The Mandalorians, fresh off of losing to themselves, weren't exactly interested in bickering with the Jedi anyways, especially with the Darksaber in a Jedi's hands. Part of Qui-Gon's instruction from their trip around the Mandalore system was the small details. In broad strokes, they covered the differences in natural beauty and scorched earth. But in between those lessons, a variety of internal matters, unrelated to the information he learned in strategy debriefings, were told. The history of the evolution in Mandalorian conflict. How one minor stone being removed unleashes an avalanche. The galaxy went in cycles, and that's what he saw with the Mythosaur, was a cycle he didn't want to see repeated in the rest of the galaxy, for the sake of everyone else involved. So what he told the Jedi was what would happen to the galaxy, but he said it in the way that made it look like it was about Mandalore. The Jedi and Mandalorians would act on planets with high crime rates, along border territory. They didn't act like deputy marshals or anything, but they put down pirates and scum. These were not violent acts of viciousness against people acting out of desperation. This was stopping off-world looters from tearing apart the underdeveloped. Qui-Gon kept using these as teaching moments, again, to the bewilderment of the Jedi he served with. This wasn't at all a contrast to typical Jedi behavior. They always worked this way. They helped those who couldn't defend themselves, but there was something everyone else was missing. It was what Satine gifted them for helping. The lesson wasn't in the act. It was in the willingness of the individuals funding it to act. It was a deeper problem highlighted regarding the Republic. Satine was a monarch, one who had to rebuild her system from the ground up, and even though 1% of her credits wasn't a lot, it was enough to support these warriors on their righteous endeavors. Which was quite remarkable because even though she was a die-hard pacifist, she was creating a pension to fund the warriors from their war, so they could wean themselves into more productive societal roles. Whether they joined her honor guard or became school teachers, they would be paid until then. These missions were being paid for, and the Jedi, they had funding too. Not like the Jedi got paid a salary, but they needed credits for food, water, fuel, and other necessities that were handled by her. Qui Gon Jinn created a subsection of the Jedi Order, completely without the funding of the High Council or begging the Senate for it. The lesson, like those that came before it, were spoken of, but each individual Jedi, and even those of the Mandalorians that listened in, got to determine the point of it. Many were able to come to the conclusion of what Qui-Gon was pointing towards, but realistically, even if Satine's plans went perfectly, the Jedi Order couldn't pick up and move to Mandalore, and yet this is not why Qui-Gon Jinn showed them all of this in the lessons. He just continued to suggest that they keep their eyes and ears open. Pay attention to the minor things, what little things challenged what they knew about the galaxy. Meanwhile, not in confusing rhetoric, despite being Qui-Gon's apprentice, Obi-Wan was spending all of his time inside the Sundari Palace. Satine's home had been completely demolished. She was just sleeping in the undamaged sections with cots used during the war. She vowed to her people that the palace would be the last structure built inside the city. The advisors challenged her, but like Qui-Gon, she was making a point to her people. She was here for them, as her father was for them and his parents before him. Clan Kryze served the people. That was her message. Obi-Wan found himself inspired by a woman who was only a few months younger than him. Even though he thought for a moment that Qui-Gon had given up his training of him, nothing pleased Obi-Wan more than being by his dearest's side during her most trying times. Satine was a very sturdy person. She had been since her mother died early into her life, but having someone made a difference beyond what she thought was possible. The Duchess could always shove her emotions down when helping people out of the terror their war brought to them, but when it came to herself, neglect was her first language. Obi-Wan at least encouraged she take care of her fortified mind. She may have been strong, but there was more to life than stoicism, even if it was for the betterment of her people. These varying dynamics continued to aid both sides. As the months following the Civil War continued to pass by, the Council maintained routine contact with Master Jinn and his Mandalorian force, which had increased to 140 Jedi, plus Kenobi and Qui-Gon himself. The reason for this increase, and what the Jedi Council did not know about, was the budget increase for the Jedi. 1% of a rebuilding society wasn't a lot, but Sundari was starting to glimmer like it did before the war. The dockyards were a top priority of reconstruction. This allowed commerce and trade to move through the system. The damage was palpable to outsiders, but the Mandalorian society kept chugging along. However, as mentioned, that 1% budget for the Jedi started to grow. With the economy jump-starting and jobs in education and on the docking yards becoming available, the planet started to have resources to trade. Most of this was just salvage, but planets could buy salvage. Some of the deals made were future securities too. So Mandalore produced certain products and then promised to secure a lane in the docking yard for that specific system to use when it was available. It did limit their already limited space, but these were credits in their pockets and used to grow their society. Salvage from Kaldabi and Sundari were important commodities for the regrowth of their system. The promised 1% of credits would go to the Jedi, and this is where the real kicker started. Since the Jedi were scaring off local thugs, off-planet pirates, and assisting with maintaining order, systems were able to at least produce what was needed for themselves. But oh hey, remember that Mandalore was in a state of rebuilding? Well, what's better than forming trade alliances? Qui-Gon promised to keep their work on these planets away from Satine's desk. As long as it was productive, she didn't really care. Mostly, this was her wanting to avoid more bloodshed knowledge. There were a few Jedi casualties, but no deaths. Qui-Gon, as per usual, was encouraging the least violent approach. But you know, Mandalorians were terrifying to anyone they didn't lose a war to. So for these Outer Rim dimwits, it was like seeing a fully fledged army marching through their backyard. Mandalorians and Jedi were a scary duo, and it was enough of a force to see once and encourage groups to stay away for a while. Qui-Gon, of course, was more interested in the seeds of his visions, but he was content with the early work done, though what slowly started to become an odd string of coincidences were what the Jedi Master least expected to see. Qui-Gon was well versed in popular faces across the galaxy. Individuals who vocally supported certain politicians never did business outside the core, especially not wealthy bankers like Hego Damas II. The reason his name kept coming up was the little things, something you wouldn't expect a banker to be involved in. Since the Jedi weren't involved in Outer Rim problems and certainly didn't deal with local thugs without Republic enforcement, which they never got, there were an odd amount of investments. Documents with the bank name on them existed out here. Some were actual bank statements, others were agreements, some were cease and desist until further notice letters, and all of them had signatures on them. Not the typical in an email signature that was just a copy-paste, but actually signed by the man himself. This was puzzling to the Jedi, but they collected the documents and held them. They made copies and sent them back to the Jedi Council on Coruscant with an encoded message. Qui-Gon did not want this information breaking out. It was to remain as quiet as possible until further notice. The Jedi continued to spot this, even going further into the Outer Rim. Most of the planets that they dealt with were technically within Republic jurisdiction, but the Senate didn't care, and the Jedi didn't have enough funding to act in the way that the Mandalorian Order was, both because of proximity and distance, but also because they didn't have the funding. There was a legitimate benefit to having Mandalorian warriors with the Jedi Task Force. A big reason is because thugs had gotten used to the Jedi ruse. For the last 100 or so years, the Jedi would act on a problem, cover it up with a band-aid, and return to the core. Thugs had gotten used to that rhythm, so every time Jedi interference happened, things would be peaceful for a month or two, and then again, the problem would arise. This, though, was different. Mandalorians were actual warriors. They put down insurgents who carried weapons, and they were a lot less forgiving. This was still covered in Satine's budget for the planet, but it was kind of grouped up with the Jedi business. So, per Qui-Gon's request, since they had additional funds, the Jedi 1% would go into the Mandalorian military force aiding them. This was the lesson Qui-Gon wanted people, especially Jedi, to see, and they finally got the point. The Jedi were not the problem. They did contribute to it, absolutely, but they were not the end-all be-all of the problem. If they wanted to erase this kind of behavior, a caring government with something more than self-interests needed to be involved. This then came back around to what Hego Damask of Megiddo was doing with his credits. His business records, according to him, were public knowledge. He had billions of credits swirling in and out of financial businesses every day. Nothing past the mid-rim had ever been accounted for, but personally signed documents to pirates, which had become the consensus by this point, was bizarre. Pirates were not a reliable business, and these were sizable payments or agreements. Like one gang made $100,000 just to knock off the deputy's office and secure a docking yard for a week, which gave them an additional 200,000 credits from the goods they stole. Another agreement had a pirate crew assault a Republic freighter for 1 million credits, and they were incentivized to destroy the defense cruiser sent to retrieve the freighter, which the pirates did do, not to mention the additional 800,000 they secured off of salvage and the 1.3 million they earned from reselling the goods in the underground markets. Something wasn't right with this, and the Jedi knew it, but just confronting a wealthy and liked bureaucrat wouldn't bode well for them. He had his fingers tangled within the Senate. Many senators would back him just because he donated to their campaigns, not to mention the people he built positive rapport with would defend him with their lives. The Jedi would continue to do good, but Qui-Gon was deeply troubled by this, and consulted his master immediately. Dooku had always been quietly proud of Qui-Gon, and like how he had ever met Obi-Wan, the old Jedi Master didn't praise his former student personally. This information, though, would be enough to draw Dooku into the investigation. In the early months of 37 BBY, the Jedi Council was growing wary of the Megiddo banker Hego Damask II. Since his documents were getting snatched up by the Jedi, he stopped doing business with local thugs. The Jedi didn't reveal anything, as they preferred to build a case against their banker foe. Hego, very intentionally, because of the documents going missing, built an alliance with the new Chancellor, Finis Valorum. This would elicit protections to him if the Jedi did anything they shouldn't be doing. Palpatine and Maul had been sent out to spy on the Mandalorian operations as well. Obi-Wan pretty much never left Satine's side, and there was a good dozen or so Jedi on Mandalore all the time. Kenobi had become a knight, because Qui-Gon foresaw Obi-Wan becoming a better Jedi than he could ever be. Kenobi appreciated this, and even though he was proud to be a knight, he wasn't a better Jedi than Qui-Gon. He and Satine secretly married after Mandalore saw their first positive year in revenue, without a debt ceiling. There was still some rebuilding to be done in the city, but a lot of the new infrastructure was being put into Sundari, so most of the wounds from the Civil War had been covered up by this point. Keldabe at this point was also just a docking yard, and a high-speed underground railroad was being created so they could transport goods to Sundari. The only reason this docking yard was being put into the ruins of Keldabe was due to the Outer Rim traffic going into it. Mandalorian guards and Jedi Knights were patrolling the docks to stop human trafficking and spice traders from sneaking into Sundari. It was a very important job, and it worked really well. Though the Keldabe docking yards was part of the reason for Mandalore's aggressive growth, it also wouldn't have been accomplished without Qui-Gon's split Mandalorian Jedi Order. No, Mandalorians didn't carry lightsabers, and most Jedi refrained from using blasters. The darksaber was also still in Qui-Gon's control, but never on his body, to discourage individuals from trying to challenge him. Anyways, there was a final dagger to use against Hago Damask. Since the Sith realized they were being pushed away from creating a Republic divide, they were speaking to the Hutts, just beyond Mandalorian territory. The reason Hago was at all invested in spending money on pirates and thugs was to decrease Republic territory, and create tension that would eventually lead to a separatist uprising. Instead, because of the Mandalorian Jedi sect, he was creating a bidding war for Mandalore. People were giving the Duchess and her people luxurious gifts to lure them into the Republic. Planets that would have become separatists wanted Satine to join them, so they could use Mandalore for support inside committees, caucuses, or commissions. She didn't budge. She would never join the Republic. Her people loved their neutrality and they adored their leader. She also did want to reduce the military presence of her people, but because of their expansive docking yards, she couldn't really afford to do that. It was too risky. The Mandalorian warrior traditions, as a result, were quieted down. Also, as a side, Satine and Bo-Katan reunited midway through Reconstruction. The Jedi, with Dooku now involved, were getting testy with the Hutts. One big benefit the Hutts had over the Mandalorians was their fleets. It wasn't large, it was just bigger than what Mandalore didn't have. However, when it came to ground invasions or even Hutt ships entering atmospheres, they were pretty defenseless. The stalemate produced information when Dooku led a strike force of Mandalorians into Hutt space. They captured Zero the Hutt before he could get his club bouncing on Coruscant. He was captured on Quesh, just north of the Hutt capital of Nal Hutta. Zero was a big talker and a little weasel. He tried to broker a deal. He confessed that Hago Damask was paying the Syndicate 40 million credits to take territory, with an incentive of 50 million credits per planet they captured. This was furthering what he tried to do earlier, and now it was exposed. As it turns out, Hago's public businesses were just cover-ups. Zero had done some digging for personal interest. He actually planned to blackmail the banker so he could get his club on Coruscant a lot cheaper. Obviously, he didn't know that Hago was a Sith Lord. The information was so damning that the Jedi had to collect it and bring everything with them back to Coruscant, which meant a Hutt would testify in front of the Galactic Senate itself. Qui Gon and Obi-Wan would not be involved with this. Maul was being sent to assassinate Satine, because a rumor got back to Plagueis about Zero talking before he testified. Palpatine wasn't able to do anything because he was supposed to be inside the Senate for this session, and the Sith Lord, Plagueis, started trying to burn documents when the team of Mace Windu, Yoda, and Oba Rancisis confronted him with a bundle of temple guards. They had no idea Plagueis was a Sith Lord. They were just arresting him, but he attacked them. As Dooku, Zero, and the Jedi Mandalorians revealed all their collected documents from the past 3 years, a generational duel was commencing across the capital. Oba Rancisis was the first Jedi killed. Plagueis was aiming for Windu, but he reacted. Rancisis did not, and he paid for it. Plagueis was a hulking combatant, but with a squad of temple guards backed by the two most experienced and talented duelists in the Order, he was kind of outmatched. The pod really did the most damage to Plagueis' otherwise perfect form. It was a Jedi cheat code, and despite Plagueis putting up a remarkable fight, he'd be cut to pieces and captured. In the fight, he lost his arms and was cut across the chest. The Jedi really wanted him to testify. Yet, even with the theatrics in the offices of Damask Holdings, there were some other exciting things happening inside the Senate. As Zero was explaining everything, all of which having been recorded anyways, in case he got assassinated or killed himself, he was force choked. Dooku, standing next to him, was surprised. He didn't care for the slug. He instead searched the thousands of pods to see who was doing it, and spotted the one. Yeah, force choking a Hutt required an extensive amount of effort from the other side of the chambers. Palpatine assumed the Jedi'd be more concerned with Zero than him. He was hoping to frame the Jedi for killing Zero, and then create a case where the Jedi looked like they were responsible for all the Outer Rim carnage, but then tried to pass the blame elsewhere. Anyways, he didn't have a chance to, because the ever-so-patient Dooku ripped his lightsaber out and lunged across the chambers. Palpatine had just enough time to pull his weapon out to defend himself. In a contest of the Force, Sidious would have no problem winning, but as their duel moved from the Senate pods to the Rotunda, Dooku used his masterful expertise in lightsaber combat, at the peak of his physical health against a much younger Sith apprentice. Palpatine fought with his might, and even did use the Force against Dooku, but student of the Grand Master of the Jedi Order was able to parry where he needed to, despite lacking some of the natural gifts that Palpatine had, and he slung his lightsaber through Palpatine's chest, ending the apprentice's life. At the same time, on Mandalore, Maul wouldn't even make it to the throne room. He made a slight mistake on his approach. He wasn't stupid, he just made a costly mistake. Due to some reconstruction around the capital, he accidentally broke into the Jedi headquarters. It wasn't necessarily his fault because its design emulated the Sundari Palace, and it didn't have the Jedi crest on it yet because it was still being crafted, so he was captured immediately. The entire Senate ordeal would make headlines for half a month. Valorum, even though he had pretty much been bought by Plagueis, couldn't technically defend him. They had all the proof, and the Senate was looking really fragile at the moment. The Trade Federation, Techno Union, Commerce Guild, and banking clans would receive immediate reviews as a result of the Damask Holdings incident, and the Sith Lord would be taken into custody by the Jedi. Also, Dooku would get jail time for about a week for killing a Republic senator, until an Old Republic law about the Sith resurfaced and ended his incarceration. Qui-Gon, outside these events, would still not be convinced of the freedom from the Sith. He worried because his visions didn't include the Sith. They were luckily just taken out as a result of the work they were doing in the Outer Rim. But Qui-Gon's visions included something that he thought would start a galactic war. It obviously happened before his attack with Vizsla, and he worried that by killing the Mandalorian, it could disrupt the vision from happening in the way he saw it unfold. In other words, he didn't want the same uprising to happen in a way he couldn't stop it. Regardless, in all fairness, he did have a Clone War vision, but it wasn't of the Clone Wars. It was of Pre-Vizsla accompanied by the leaders of the major criminal organizations in the Outer Rim. So, in all fairness to Qui-Gon, he thought that this would be the return of the Nihil, or the grouping up of the most powerful Outer Rim syndicates seen in history. That would inevitably never come. With the Sith now dead, and the Senate pushing back against the conglomerates, there'd be a new era of tension. But for Mandalore, that wouldn't really exist. Much of their work went under the radar, and it was strategically created to avoid Federation and Union spaces. So their trade routes weren't being overseen by the major power players. There would be threats of blockades and even potential chances at war, but it wouldn't ever come. Much of this would be Republic propaganda anyways. Basically, Valorum funded a bunch of ads to tell people to stop buying from the major groups. It was a full-blown boycott, so all products produced by these players would sit on shelves and either go bad or get overstocked. It did lead to some fundamental problems on the supply chain, but the Republic would survive. It would bankrupt these groups, and the Republic would use their assets for good. The Jedi Mandalorian group under Master Jinn's command would continue to expand. They didn't go into full-blown war with the Hutt Syndicate, but they scared them off Hutt territory. Qui-Gon, once again, would be offered a spot in the High Council, and he would again reject it, believing he had more to accomplish. Over the next 10 years, much would shift in the galaxy. Mandalore would be the largest political entity on this side of the galaxy, not within the Republic. There would be some economic standoffs with the Republic, but nothing nearly as tense as the frustrations with the corporations that had already been put to sleep by this point. The Jedi Mandalorian sect of the Jedi Order, which had become an independent branch that worked in coalition with the Council, was now 1,500 members strong. These were not all Jedi. A majority were Mandalorian special forces, like Bo-Katan. Individuals who prided their warrior way, but agreed to use it in a more refined manner. Obi-Wan and Satine at this point had themselves a kid, and it was the reason why Obi-Wan stepped down from the Jedi Order. They were pretty much in their 30s by this point, so it worked out for everyone. A new heir to the throne, one the Duchess and Duke Consort were very proud of. Qui-Gon was happy that his apprentice was happy, but he was facing other struggles. The Republic dedicated resources to stopping Outer Rim threats from rising. Mandalore's predominantly popular position meant that there were threats of secession to join the Mandalorian coalition. Satine refused these moves because her position was standing up for the underrepresented in the Outer Rim, those that she did trade with. The trouble came from skirmishes with the Hutts, though this did lead to the breaking up of several slave rings across the Outer Rim, and completely ripping through the Zagirian slave empire. Much of this work was done by Republic security and judiciary groups, after the Mandalorians made a lot of progress by themselves. This was the Senate's way of trying to own the Mandalorians. Satine was just happy that the Republic was doing what it was supposed to be doing. Mandalore also, as a result, didn't conquer territory. The Republic did. This, though, did allow the Jedi Mandalorian sect to bring in many new students, from Zygeria to Kessel and the Rishi Maze to Tatooine. This also meant that refugees from planets across the Outer Rim came to Mandalore as well. A lot of the petty bickering between the Republic and Mandalore would continue. It just got under the Senate's skin that Mandalore was a neutral system with as much prosperity as it had. But in their jealousy, the Republic was able to do what it was meant to do, and that's help people. This, as a result, allowed the Jedi both of Coruscant and Mandalore to work on behalf of the people. The Jedi Council would, as a result, regard Qui Gon Jinn as the greatest Jedi to ever live, something he humbly disagreed with. But he did at least appreciate the consideration. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Is this a wholesome PP story? I'm not sure. Let's talk about it though. A lot of what I wanted to kind of capture here is Qui-Gon's visions meant to coincide with what he experiences on Mandalore. A lot of it's supposed to be parallels to what he sees, and this is kind of how I've interpreted a very important scene in the Reign of the Empire book that I thought was really good between Saw Gerrera and another character. And a lot of it is Saw Gerrera comparing Onderon to the rise of the Empire. And that's kind of what Qui-Gon's doing with Mandalore, kind of in reverse though. So the ashes of Keldabi is what's going to happen. You see the peace on Concordia? Well, do you like it? This is what the galaxy is now. What I saw in this vision that I'm not telling you about is what's going to happen, and is what you're feeling on Keldabi. That's a lot of what Qui-Gon's doing, and it's meant to be kind of confusing. It's like, what are you trying to say, Qui-Gon? And Qui-Gon kind of talks in these riddles, and I think that's why the Jedi Council had issues with him, is because he kind of talks in riddles a little too much, and that's kind of what I wanted to personify here, is him being like in the shadows a little bit with what he's trying to say, because truthfully speaking, the Jedi Council and the Jedi that volunteered to be with him would probably turn a blind eye if he just blatantly said, this is what I saw, this all is going to happen, because Sifo Dyas saw a war and no one believed him. And so I think it'd be best if Sifo Dyas was a little out there too, but I think it'd be best in this scenario where Qui-Gon is very quiet about it, it's very methodical. And I think it creates an order that's more beneficial for both sides. In a similar way to the Mandalorian Empire and the Satine Mandalore Warrior video, I'm not quite sure, I might be misremembering, but similar to those, Satine rebuilds a society in like 15 years, like from the ground up. And I have no doubt that in a scenario where Mandalore has its own warriors that aren't against her, because Death Watch is completely removed from the equation here, with warriors following one sect, I think rebuilding would go a lot quicker. I also think using trade with systems that have been kind of abandoned by the Republic would also aid them with building their population and the society a lot better as well. So anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.